Kidding. I'm Danny Leipziger. I'm a prof in the International Business Department here at GW, and I also run something called the Growth Dialogue. We are joined today by three illustrious panelists. Dr. Mauricio Cárdenas, who's a visiting research scholar at Colombia and previously was Minister of Finance and Public Credit, among other ministerial appointments in the government of Colombia. He's been at Brookings and at various other institutions. And so welcome very much. We're glad to see you, Mauricio. Our second panelist is Dr. Nora Lustig, who is a professor of Latin American Studies at Tulane. She's also the director of the Commitment to Equity Institute and has done some really path-breaking work on poverty and inequality. So welcome, Nora. And our third panelist is Dr. Bill Maloney, who's the chief economist for the Latin America and Caribbean region of the World Bank, and a former colleague of mine. And he has quite a lot of experience in the region in a variety of different posts. So I think the purpose of this conversation for the next hour or so is really driven by the fact that many people are concerned that the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean is sort of the forgotten region. You just have to look at deaths per thousand in Peru or in Brazil to see the impact of COVID. But there are other economic and social implications that lead one to worry that perhaps Latin America might be facing some hard times ahead. And it doesn't seem to get quite the recognition as a problem as do other parts of the world. I would just note that CIPAL, the UN agency for Latin America's, ECLA, the Economic Commission for Latin America, recently put out some data on poverty in the region, and it showed some alarming increases in poverty in the last couple of years, as high as 44% in Mexico, Professor Lustig's country, more than 30% in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, and roughly 25% in Brazil, Paraguay, and a few others. So a region that had made some progress in the last decade or two seems to be suffering a big setback. On top of which, if we look at the IMF's regional economic outlook that came out in October, the outlook is that it may take until 2024, 2025 for the Latin America region countries to get back to their pre-pandemic sort of 2019 growth paths. So I think there's some good reasons to be concerned, and we have a panel that covers a wide range of areas dealing with Latin American economics. So I think we're very fortunate to have the three of you, and thank you very much for joining. Benigno Lopez unexpectedly had to go on mission for the IDB, and so he cannot join us today, but we will make sure that he gets a copy of what we talk about. So the format for this panel is that I'm going to ask a series of questions, not exactly in the same order, but in some logical order. And I will ask each of you to comment in 4 or 5, maximum 6 minutes to each question so that we can go through 3 rounds of questions. If we have time at the end, we'll see if we can take some questions from the participants who've joined us, and we have more than 35 of them at the moment. So Mauricio, let me start with you. I think the regional economic outlook that the fund put out said that Latin America's recovery was underway. It was uneven. They always say that, but that the gross financing needs for the region were going to be quite high, given the emergency spending, given lower taxes, given the debt situation that a number of countries' external debt situation face. And now we know that the Fed and others are going to have to move to raise rates we don't know what speed or how much, but we know the direction of change. So I'm sort of interested in your views on the macro picture for Latin America and what you see 2022 and 2023 doing in terms of progress in the region. Mauricio.
Well, thank you, Danny. It's great to be here, and I'm really thankful for convening us. It's the first time I interact with Bill in his new capacity as the chief economist for Latin America at the World Bank, and Nora and I have been constantly interacting throughout the pandemic, discussing with a large group of economists and other social scientists in the region. So it's been a really remarkable opportunity to interact, and we've used this to the extent possible. Let me begin by saying that there are two reports. If your students are actually listening, there are two reports that I think people should read very carefully. One is obviously the regional economic outlook that you alluded to from the IMF, published last October. But the second one is the report that was actually published by the Office of the Chief Economist for Latin America at the World Bank, which provides a very interesting angle about the recovery and about the challenges that the region has ahead. So I would basically make 3 points. This is the region that was growing at the slowest pace prior to the pandemic. So Latin America already had a big growth problem. The pandemic was devastating for the region. So also was the region with the largest negative impact last year. It's growing this year at a relatively healthy rate. It's going to grow close to 7%. But then the negative aspect is that all projections, World Bank, IMF included, suggest that growth in 2022 is going to go back to around 3.5%, 4%, which means that the region is not going to come out of this crisis with renewed growth. It's going to go back to essentially relatively low growth. So why is that? Why is it that the region was most impacted by the pandemic? Why is it that the region is not really solving these long-standing problems that prevent growth from really being faster? I think that's the real question. I would just say that, in my view, the challenges ahead are going to be even greater because of the higher levels of public debt. So public debt means in the region, generally speaking, fiscal consolidation. And fiscal consolidation restricts the ability of governments to invest more in public goods, to invest in key elements for economic growth. So the name of the game is really productivity. We have to do more with less. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to grow faster. So the challenge for governments today in the region is to be more efficient at the public level, at the private sector, because the region will be forced to essentially spend more wisely. And the reports that suggest how to do that and how to select those areas in which we can be better at using these more limited resources, I think, are the reports that are necessary for the region, to guide the region into the future. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Mauricio. We'll come back to the productivity angle a bit later. I wanted to turn to Nora because some Latin American governments have managed some of the social dislocations and emergency assistance better than others. Some were able to target better than others. So I thought maybe you could just briefly tell us who's done well, who's done badly, and in general, how effective you think some of these programs have been.
First to unmute, thank you. And I wanted to mention something in addition to everything that you mentioned about the three of us. Great to see you, Bill and Mauricio. I think we're all Berkeley.
That's true.
I'm not hearing you.
She said, "Go Bears."
Exactly. And I said, we're all Berkeley PhD graduates, and we all had Albert Fishlow, as our mentor. Am I right?
I think that's correct.
Yes. So there you go. I mean, that was part of something that you
Fishlow-
probably didn't know. But
Fishlow
anyway,
did well.
let me answer your question. Yeah, one very interesting thing is that although the region has been hit systematically throughout, the response on the part of governments has been very heterogeneous. And in one extreme, I think we have Brazil, that was able to deploy cash transfers very quickly and with a very large coverage. Remember that everybody was worried, what are you going to do with the informal workers that are not part of the formal sector, so they're not going to get anything in the form of social insurance, and they're not part of the cash transfer programs. But they were able to deploy it very quickly. And so in Brazil, one peculiar result, and this in fact was also in the report that the bank produced mid-year on the middle class that was presented a while ago, and also results from Brazilian researchers and our own research with the microsimulations we did, turns out that poverty and inequality in 2020 in Brazil could have been lower than in 2019. That was the extent to which the response went. Not sustainable, granted, maybe with lots of errors of inclusion and other things, but they were able to respond very quickly. On the other extreme, you have Mexico. Mexico did not expand any of its existing safety nets at the federal level. Some state governments introduced small state programs at the level of the state. So it's a country that experienced probably, like you already mentioned, the largest increase in poverty because the mitigation policies were simply not there. It's interesting because that's linked to the macroeconomic policy that Mexico pursued also, because they resisted. I think it's the only government, along with another one in the entire world, that did not introduce a counter-cyclical policy at the macro level, but they didn't introduce it either at the safety net level. Even, if it was a smaller amount of spending that it could have expanded, they did not. So poverty increased substantially in Mexico, and in the context of Brazil, it didn't. And then you have everything in between. Some tried, like Peru, but were not very effective at the beginning. Chile is another case that did quite well. Argentina also was able to compensate people by deploying programs quite quickly. And we're talking about millions. In the case of Brazil, millions and millions. So there's something to learn here. And I think, moving forward, when people say, so what are you going to do since systemic shocks are should no longer be considered like infrequent events? You may have not a pandemic every year, but you have an economic crisis, you have natural disasters, you have epidemics. So since they're pretty frequent, you need to have some form of it, an institutionalized safety net to deal with systemic shocks. And I can talk about them a little later, but what I think should that be.
Okay, we can come back to, in particular, to Brazil later, because obviously there's some macro implications of their largesse. If you look at, the fiscal deficit in Brazil was doing better because of some of the reforms, and it's gotten very large again, and now internal debt is quite high and debt service is high. And anyway, it has ramifications. But let me turn to Bill, because you're the labor market expert here, and labor markets. Nora mentioned that they were able to provide some support. There were some job retention schemes in some countries, but then in most countries, informal workers are not covered. Women tend to be more informal than formal. So there's some serious implications for inequality, for poverty, and this is something that the World Bank cares deeply about. So I wondered if you had a view on how bad the situation has gotten and what can be done about it.
Thanks, Danny. And as with the others, I'm really happy to be here and to be able to think through some of the problems we're going to be facing going forward. The labor market adjusted in a way that was very different from the way it normally adjusts during a crisis. Employment fell by roughly 20% during the crisis, and it still hasn't fully recovered. But what's interesting is that the normal patterns of, for instance, the informal sector picking up some of the slack didn't happen. And also the fact that labor market participation fell a lot and was partly a driver of the fall in employment. And the reason when you think about this, it actually makes sense. It's just because of the possibility of contagion. We did some studies in the United States, in the bank on, for instance, when restaurant reservations stopped in the United States. And it was long before there was any lockdown. It was just people were saying, oh, no, it's too dangerous. I'm not going out to a restaurant. Well, the same thing happens in the informal sector where you have a lot of people working cheek by jowl, or it's often a service industry where there's a lot of face-to-face contact. So you find that there's a study by Levin Urrutia from ITAM that found that in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, actually informality fell in the early part of the crisis, simply because people just stayed home. And that is also shows up in the labor market labor participation numbers. So people just said it's too dangerous. And some folks at the University of the Andes have kind of modeled labor market adjusted when you have this kind of contagion problem going on. And it's substantially different. The policy conclusions of how we should approach this, how we should approach cushioning these shocks is very different. So that's going to be interesting to study going forward. So we can learn about this, and hopefully this will be our last pandemic for a while, but probably not. From a point of view of inequality, what worries me more is not the short run impact on inequality, which will be problematic, but the longer term. We see across the region pretty much a loss of 1.5 years of education because of schools shutting down. Schools didn't shut down everywhere in the world, and where they didn't shut down to the degree they did in Latin America. And we have to think about why that happened. But the fact is that's a huge loss in human capital for a region where employers frequently claim that they're having a really hard time getting skilled labor. But it's also a shock to human capital that was really unequally distributed. The school that my daughter went to in Bogota, I'm sure, had everything online. But there was an article in the New York Times several months ago on Soacha and Bogota, and just talking about how, the bottom 2 quintiles don't have access to the internet, and you can't download homework assignments on your cell phone, so on your flip phone. So basically, a huge chunk of the poor or the less well-off lost a full year and a half, and that is going to show up in labor market performance over the next 50 years if we don't do something to remedy that. Just briefly on the poverty numbers, Nora is exactly right. It's very interesting that if you take the region as a whole, we didn't do badly. But if you take out Brazil, which actually seemed to engineer a fall in poverty, the rest of the region, poverty measured by share of people living on under $5.50 a day, went from about 23 to 27%. So I can't argue with that. And those are some of the highest rates we've seen in a decade and a half. So on both the long-run inequality front and in remedying some of the shock that came through poverty, we've got some work to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me skip ahead because the area of educational losses and intergenerational effects is something that Nora has done a lot of research on, and she was sharing some preliminary findings with me, I guess, from you and some of your colleagues. So maybe I should turn to you now, Nora, and ask you about the education issue and the long-term implications for the region of schools being closed and kids dropping out or losing years of schooling. Remember, the World Bank has done this analysis on years of learning versus years of schooling, and it's always shocking when you say, her country, the average is 10 years of schooling, but the average in terms of learning is 6 years. That's not unusual for many countries, even prior to this. But Nora, can we turn to you and get your insights?
Yes, thank you. Actually, they're not preliminary. The results may be not accurate, but they're not preliminary. We got a paper published in the Journal of Economic Inequality already. So what we did is, as you know, with a couple of colleagues, Neidhofer and from ZU and Mariano Tomasi in Universidad of San Andres in Argentina, is we, using the common word now casted the impact of the reductions in school days on intergenerational mobility and high school completion rates for children of different parental educational backgrounds. And what came out, even, we think this may be to some extent a lower bound, because we are focusing on whether people would be able or not to complete high school. We do not calculate the cumulative effect of what might happen with people that are not finishing earlier years. And what we came up with is kind of, let me show you the sort of scary graph here, because I think it's interesting to see the movie and what the picture looks now. So here you have high school completion rate for the region as a whole on average over the decades by cohort of birth. So children born in the 1940s, children born in the early 2000s, which are the ones that are in school now. And this is for children of high educated parents. This is for children low educated parents. High means high school or above, low below high school. And you can see that over time, the rate at which they were able to complete high school was narrowing. And I am completely in agreement with Bill on how this has to be stressed, because in the past, the fact that this was happening, I think, contributed to the peculiar outcome in Latin America, in which we observed inequality falling in the earlier part of this century. Inequality fell in part because the inequality in the distribution of education was changing, and the people with low skills were becoming relatively scarce. The dotted line tells you would have been the trend without COVID. The solid line in the last segment, I hope you can see my cursor, is what's happening as a result of the pandemic. And essentially, it translates into a 15 percentage point increase in the difference. It varies by country, but every country experiences. Even, Brazil did very well. Like Bill was saying, the short term may be good, but the longer term looks pretty horrible also in Brazil. And it actually, brings you the children that were born in this cohort in the early 2000s may have high school completion rates that are more similar to children that were born in the 1960s. So it's a huge shock. Depending on the scale, this may translate into something that's going to affect growth. We were talking about productivity, Mauricio. You're going to have a less productive labor force in the future. It may also result in higher inequality of opportunity and also higher wage inequality as a result of a reversal of what we were observing in the previous decades. So this, I'm always emphasizing this as a very serious problem. And I don't see if you want, the sort of hump that you would need to actually address it quickly enough so that you have some remediation of this that could contain the fallout. This fallout will last for decades. This is a lasting scar. And if we don't do anything now, forget it. This is going to be a curse, if you want, for Latin America's development in the future. And I'm curious, Bill, you're the bank, what is the bank doing to prod? And it's not just governments. You're going to need participation also from other actors in society if you want to address it. I think the private sector, both for business and philanthropic, will have to come in to help remediate the situation. And I think we need to do it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Well, I will come to Bill in a moment. I think, as you know, at the bank, lending is based on country circumstances in aggregate as well as an average. So we don't have specific programs that are going to deal with inequality in the education sector. But I think the bank has ramped up its lending, similar to the fund. And a lot of it, at least from the fund side, has been relatively unconditional. And I imagine from the bank side as well. So maybe just, Bill, we give you a minute or two before we turn to Mauricio again to respond as to what types of programs the bank has been starting or ramping up to deal with some aspects of this problem?
So to be completely honest, as you said, the first wave of lending during COVID was targeted towards exactly cushioning the impact. And I would say right now we're still focused on getting everyone vaccinated. The key to getting growth started is precisely ensuring that we make progress on that. Some countries like Chile and Uruguay are like above 70%. And Colombia is going to make their target probably by January of, I think, 70%. There are a bunch of countries in the middle, like Argentina, which are growing fastly. There's a whole group of countries in the South, Central America, and in the Central America and the islands, which are really far behind, and we're not going to see any growth in those countries until people feel comfortable, particularly tourists, in going out. So that's kind of where we're focusing. But we are beginning to look precisely at these issues that that Nora is talking about, which is how do you reallocate existing resources to reach exactly those students, as she pointed out, really were hit and lost a year, so we don't have the long run inequality impacts. And more generally, we have to think through why it is that schools,
because of the pandemic,
schools shut down so completely, and how we can prevent that happening next time. I'll stop there.
Okay.
And I'm going to turn on the lights.
The reallocation and the role that government can play is one of these tough ones, because I'm going to turn to Mauricio, because you've faced these kinds of trade-offs and constraints when you were minister. There are a lot of demands for resources, and there are a lot of programs that are meritorious. But then there are also the bigger picture, what's your debt profile and how do the markets perceive your fiscal behavior. So in 2021, there's been sort of a understanding with the IMF and with others that countries are going to spend more. There's the famous Kristalina quote about spend but keep the receipts. That sort of runs out of steam after a year or two when budgets explode, as we've seen now in some countries. So from your vantage point, and maybe using Colombia as an example, how do you see the trade-offs and the ability to deal with some of these social and economic dislocations that require resources?
Sure. Well, I'm really happy the conversation is taking this turn on the scarring effects and the legacy effects of the pandemic, because I think this is really the right focus of the conversation. The last 6 months, everything was about vaccination, reopening of schools, and making sure that people, were back in business. But it's now the right time to think about the consequences of all this, not just for long-term economic growth, potential economic growth, but also for inequality. And I think education is the right focus, because the studies everywhere have suggested the same kind of like order of magnitude, and are very supportive of the evidence that Nora has just shared with us. this was a loss of between a year and a half in actual learning. And many schools are still closed. Here in Colombia, for example, there are a number of schools that have not reopened. And it's well known also that virtual platforms did not reach to almost half of the population. So this is a serious issue. How are we going to overcome this? Because I see these potentially having very negative effects, both on long-term growth and the trend in inequality. There are a number of studies that are being now kind of like written and some preliminary information about how to overcome that effect. The remedy is the key word here. What is the remedy? And the remedy normally means kids spending more hours in school, older kids spending time with the younger kids, university students spending time with high school students. But this is not just a government issue. This involves all society. And this means that we all need to be involved, because a year or a year and a half in educational losses is tremendous. But the most worrisome outcome is the interruption, the permanent interruption of schooling. If people just don't go back, because then it's not a year and a half. It just means that, you know, as the figures that Nora showed, the likelihood of finishing high school is reduced by 15 percentage points, which is tremendous. So the focus of the conversation should be there. So your question was very good. What is the World Bank doing about this? You know, I think the World Bank is from what I read, the work of Jaime Saavedra and others, the World Bank is thinking about these issues, but there is no one formula. I've seen this example of the Italians. Orazio Atanasio has written about this, that the Italians put the older students to help the younger students now when schools reopened. But I don't think there is a systematic formula, but this is what we should be thinking about. Now, we talked about scarring effects, and I fully agree. Education is the number one priority, but there are other scarring effects, like bankruptcy of firms that would not reopen, and some job losses that are now evident, that are hard to recover. We have faster economic growth than job growth. And that's another question we should address. Why is that? Why is it that growth in terms of jobs is falling behind, especially in the case of women? Because you see jobs in the case of men have recovered almost to 100%, almost to where the level was before the pandemic. But women are still, say, relative to 100, they're still between 92 and 93. So it's a 7% gap in terms of female jobs. Mm-hmm. I'll stop there.
Nora, can we come back to you on the remedy side? So I think there's, you know, agreement, at least among the three of you, about the problems of scarring in the education sector, dropouts, as well as loss of learning. So are there you know, positive examples? Mauricio mentioned what they're suggesting in Italy, but are there positive examples in the region for dealing with the problem, which is sort of at an emergency level?
Thanks. No, I am not an expert on that, Danny, and I think that I would just give you some broad aspects that should be contemplated. I think that, first of all, at the macro level, in terms of budget allocations, I think that that's where perhaps the multilateral organizations, not necessarily has to be alone, but also accompany countries, see how they can handle the fiscal consolidation process, in which you try to do mainly two things, in addition to reducing the fiscal deficit. One is to minimize the impact on the poor on the income side, And that will mean not only protecting safety nets from cuts, et cetera, but also being watchful in terms of how you're going to increase taxes. If you need to increase taxes and you go in the route of using consumption taxes, as we know, that may cause consumption poverty or consumable income poverty to rise. And the same if you start eliminating even general subsidies, but if the poor were receiving part of them, then you will need to be mindful on how to compensate. So that on the one hand. The other thing is, how do you protect spending on education and health from getting cuts that would be damaging? I mean, I know that spending doesn't necessarily mean better learning outcomes, but reducing spending is not necessarily going to help in that sense. So I think it might be very interesting to do some sort of macro scenarios about how you can actually handle the fiscal consolidation, which is going to be an immediate challenge, with also keeping these other matters on track by protecting the poor from becoming poor and also spending in education and health. Then, as Mauricio and Bill were saying, for the education front, I think that a lot will involve very innovative approaches to try to bring close mentorships. I mean, I don't think you're going to be able to do it with sort of just massive programs, etc. You're going to have to need what in Spanish is called cuerpo a cuerpo, no? You're going to have to involve, and that's why it's so important to think about not just governments, but a lot of community-based organizations should be brought in to help deal with this and try to catch students that are dropping out or dropped out and recover them, and or those who are not able to cope when they go back, to try to help them cope better. And I don't think at this point we have an assessment of what really works. At the same time, I think it's very important to continue focusing on connectivity, because that may help even in this process. For example, one crazy idea that I was thinking at some point is you have many retired teachers. The region, the one advantage is that people speak Spanish practically throughout the entire region. So you have portability of human capital there. As long as you can use electronic means, you may be able to match needs with supply, in which you may be able to organize people who are now retired and interested in helping kids by mentoring them in a different part in their own country, or in a different region in the country, or in a different neighborhood, or also in different countries. So these are ideas that go from the macro to the very specific, but I think we need to be very, very creative and make the point in every instance. So we make this a focus of many of the organizations, including foundations, which are now taking this issue very seriously from what I hear.
I think there's some very good ideas here, and I think we're going to leave it to Bill to run with them. And I want you to call Gordon Brown tomorrow and talk to him about this. And try to get some ideas on the table. I think the foundations, is probably the right place to look for some of these newer initiatives that might work. I might come back to the micro issues at the end, but I wanted to also spend a few minutes more on the macro issues, because the region's also facing in some inflation. Brazil's inflation rate just went double digit. Food prices are up 20% from what I read in Latin America. So apart from the implications for inequality and for poverty, which are pretty clear and dramatic, it really makes the life of a policymaker. You always say, this is the worst time to be, a policymaker. But it makes it really hard. I'm thinking now particularly of Brazil, where inflation is on the rise. The deficit is large. It had some good implications, as Nora was indicating, in terms of transfers, but they can't be maintained. And it turns out now that, debt to GDP is close to 100%. And if you look at, what's left in the budget, once you deal with constitutional issues and debt service and pensions and everything else, there's not a lot left for growth. So you're in this sort of scenario that doesn't have an easy solution. So that's why I'm turning to Mauricio now to tell us how to get out of this kind of box. And you could use Brazil or Colombia, any country in the region.
It applies to almost all of them, especially in South America. So the context today couldn't be more supportive of economic growth because we have low interest rates, we have huge fiscal deficits. I mean, the fiscal deficit, take the case of Colombia, this year is running at 10% of GDP. I mean, the highest in our history. You see where commodity prices are. It's just unbelievable. It's a growth in China, growth in the US. Hard to think of more supportive conditions for economic growth. And that's part of the reason why the region is doing relatively well this year. It's not just the bouncing back from last year, but also the fact that the external environment is very positive. But this is not going to last. And we're starting to see the pressures. And you mentioned inflation, which I think is the most obvious and the one that is now more visible to population. And central banks, fortunately, are independent. So including in countries like Brazil, what we're seeing is an increase in interest rates, and we're seeing increases in interest rates are very significant. And this is something that's going to continue going into the future. And at the same time, no matter what the political leaning of the governments are coming into office next year, because we'll have elections everywhere or almost everywhere, fiscal consolidation will be necessary. So there'll be a less supportive environment for economic growth with these legacy effects, with these carrying effects of the pandemic. So the outlook is quite challenging. I would say that from a macro perspective, this is going to be a key moment in the life of these countries, because either you keep your economic framework, your policy framework, independent central banks, inflation targeting, fiscal rules, you enforce the fiscal rules, or you go in a direction of populism, where essentially everything goes. And I think some countries could go in that direction. It's an option. And that would mean to me that we're not just going to be dealing with the crisis of a pandemic, but a much more deeper and long-lasting crisis if we actually weaken the economic foundations of these countries. And I think that scenario cannot be ruled out, especially in countries that are leaning towards populism in the region. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think. Investors are worried because they don't know what's going to happen. And they're in a position where they're waiting to see what the evolution of this is, but a bad scenario with long-lasting consequences cannot be ruled out. It will take a lot of pragmatism in the region to deal with this crisis, going back to our fundamentals, basically reducing the fiscal deficit, raising interest rates, which means that the recovery we're seeing today is going to be tamed.
Right. So I hear you and I agree. And I think you made the point earlier that growth in 2022 was, after the rebound, was going to come back down to a more normal level, and that productivity was the name of the game. So let me turn to Bill, since you've done a lot of research also on how to raise productivity. And it's of course easier said than done, but Latin America has not been able to, in most countries, register huge gains in productivity. Some studies might point to the labor force and skills and the extent of digitalization and et cetera, but from your work, given what Mauricio describes, which is a year in which you're going to have more fiscal consolidation, you're going to have some potential opportunities in the global markets, but you have to take advantage of them. And so how can Latin America position itself to be more successful to take advantage of them, to take advantage of these opportunities? And then I would come back to Nora to ask you about Mexico, because it's a country that should be taking advantage of some of these opportunities that, you know, this logistics problems and trade wars with China, et cetera, should make Mexico a much more attractive place. But Bill, what do you think about the productivity challenge and what can be done?
So just a huge issue. I depart from where Mauricio left off, which is that productivity is fundamental, has a huge component of new investment in physical capital, investment in infrastructure, investment in what we call knowledge capital, if you will, or innovation. And none of that happens easily when there's a lot of uncertainty. And so I absolutely agree that getting the fiscal situation credible, and most countries are managing it okay, but you could imagine a sharp rise in US interest rates or other shortfall, or for instance, a recurrence of the pandemic, which slows economic growth down again, could put us in a bad situation. Before Mauricio goes, you should ask him about the political economy of raising new revenues and of shifting revenues around to use them more effectively for growth purposes, because obviously he, as Minister of Finance, has a lot of experience in seeing what works and what doesn't. Aside from that, over the longer term, I'll mention the obvious ones. First of all, we have an ongoing skills problem. 30% of Latin American employers say they have trouble finding skilled labor. That compares to 20% globally. We have an ongoing problem of infrastructure, much as we do in the United States. In the 1980s, we're investing somewhere around 3.5% of GDP. Now we're closer to 1.5%. We talk a little bit about actually the work that Colombia did in the semi-annual, which I think Mauricio was behind, in a good regime for trying to crowd in more private spending there. But that's a clear challenge that's waiting for us. But I also think that more generally, we have to ask ourselves, even before COVID, we were growing at about 2.2% from 2010 to 2019, while the rest of the world was growing 3.1%. And our forecasts for the next 2 years, if everything goes as expected, are under 3%. So we're, wherever you look, it's not like we're going to be bouncing up to 6% and alleviating poverty instantly. It's not going to happen. So there's a larger question of what is it that has prevented us from generating more diversified economies. Part of the reason the slowdown in the previous decade was precisely commodity prices fell, and we're still highly dependent on that. What is it that's going to get us more diversified, and what is it that's going to get our firms more productive, more innovative, and new firms coming in? And that requires looking at the nature of our entrepreneurial ecosystem, the role of competition, or how much competition there is or not, the role of supporting structures. For instance, I think our universities, for instance, are not do not like to be that linked to the private sector in general. That's, of course, really different from the United States and from much of Europe and Asia. We need to think about overall what it takes to get us to be more entrepreneurial. And I use that in a specific sense of able to go out and identify new technologies, new goods, and particularly in this context of wanting to be greener, this is going to be important because it's going to be all about adopting greener technologies. And if we can't adopt regular technologies for growth, that's going to be a trouble for us in the green agenda as well. So we spend a lot of time in the productivity project looking both at what we call the innovation paradox, which is innovation should be really high in Latin America. It's not. Why is that? We need to think about why it is that our current firms innovate so little and we're not as entrepreneurial as we need to be to get the productivity growth we need.
Well, some of these things that you mentioned are perennial issues. And the problem is that, we just faced a economic circumstance that happens, once in 100 years. And the response to that is going to require a lot more than, the business as usual, which, as you correctly pointed out, yielded growth rates for Latin America that were below other developing regions of the world. The real question is, where does one put one's effort? You said I should press Mauricio on putting government spending into things that have a higher rate of return. I'm sure he could give us a good answer on that.
And raising new revenues.
And raising, yeah, but the IMF always says, raise more revenue, create fiscal buffers. This is sort of standard stuff, but it's very hard to do in practice. But I wanted to come to Nora. I don't have to put you on the spot on Mexico, but I'm curious what you think the international organization should be doing differently. We just had this big SDR allocation, 650 billion, roughly a little less than 10% goes to Latin America. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of overall, balance of payments issues for many countries. So where would you start? If we put you, in charge of country X, where would you start in terms of trying to provide some of the remedies that you've all spoken about for some of the negative impacts of the pandemic, but also deal with some of the longer term structural issues that have been keeping the region from reaching its full potential? Where should one start?
Well, that's why I've not been a minister. I am not. I like to sort of focus on certain things. And no, I think it'd be interesting to listen to Mauricio, as William, as Bill said, about how to deal with the political economy challenges. I think they're going to be enormous, because the middle classes are the ones that are probably going to have to bear a lot of the brunt of what needs to be done in the next stage, and that will create a lot of discontent. So I do not foresee a happy picture for Latin America now, the future. But given what I now know, I'm just going to tell you where would I put emphasis if I was in charge of sort of designing broadly social policy. There's a lot of discussion now about whether should you implement the universal basic income, given that you have recurrent shocks, and that might be a way to have everybody insured against a shock. And I think that's not the way to go, because to have a UBI that is sufficient in terms of generosity, that helps the poor in their current situation, and reduces poverty, will not be compatible with what you need on the fiscal end. So I think that, what several of us are proposing now, and I think the bank is too, is more something like a contingent UBI, a contingent universal basic income that would be deployed in the context of systemic shocks that our region is exposed so frequently. So I would invest in devising institutions that are needed, the information base that is needed, and also to see how the resources will be made available in case of a shock, so that you can have this cushioning in the short term. And the second thing, as I said earlier, I would make the fiscal consolidation designed as much as possible as pro-poor, with the elements that I said earlier, and focusing on how to use the spending on education and health to make sure that the scarring effects are do not materialize as much as we see now. In the case of Mexico, I just want to say one thing. I don't think the government is really implementing a strategy that's growth focused, frankly. And I don't think productivity growth is something that's in the radar screen. I think that the economic recovery for Mexico was the US recovery, the policy, it was not counter-cyclical policy, it was whatever happened to the U.S., hoping that the U.S. will pull. For some reason, also the strategy on the political front has been not to antagonize the U.S., no matter what the U.S. did. And that's, I think, more, I would not bet on something very different from what we've seen in Mexico, which has been mediocre growth moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the pro-poor fiscal policies and who bears the brunt of some of these reallocations of government spending, luckily, Mauricio, you're not the minister anymore, but you can never tell. What would you say, and how do you deal with the political economy issues that Nora and Bill have raised?
Well, we already have one data point that I think is useful, which is the failed attempt by the Colombian government to introduce a tax bill in April, May this year, that resulted in a significant social explosion that probably you saw in the media, and ended up with the government withdrawing that proposal, and basically the finance minister lost his job. So I think that is sending a signal throughout the region that these reforms that basically increase the level of taxation on the middle class are very difficult, especially at these times, because let's keep in mind that poverty increased throughout the region. We know the exception of Brazil, which essentially meant that the size of the middle class was reduced. In the case of Colombia, the numbers are quite clear. The middle class in 2019 was 30% of the population, and now it's 25% of the population. So the middle class lost in relative terms during the pandemic. And so that means that these reforms that involve, for example, you mentioned that at the beginning, raising the VAT or widening the tax base of the personal income tax are reforms that are very difficult to pass now and in 6 months and in a year. So I think that's a new reality, which means that the opportunities for an increase in taxation are related more to the reduction in tax exemptions, in loopholes, closing loopholes, or increasing wealth taxes, or making the personal income tax more progressive. That's where I think things will evolve in the future. Corporate taxation has already kind of like showed that there are limits there, and that if anything, although now we have the OECD establishing kind of like a minimum threshold, but the countries in Latin America are still quite above that threshold. So we will continue to see some race to the bottom in that area. So the space for an increase in taxation is quite limited. All the conversation gravitates around a reduction in tax evasion. And the reduction in tax evasion means more technology, better systems, better tax administration, of course, international cooperation, sharing data, declaring tax havens as such, all those aspects, or the taxation of global corporations that do business in the region but pay very little taxes here. That is also part of the agenda. That's where I see that conversation evolving in the future. But that will not be enough. The revenues you can raise through those reforms are limited. So what the region will need, and this is in a way something that goes at odds with this idea of investing more and doing more public investment, is that we'll need to reduce government expenditures. That's especially relative to the levels that they are now after the pandemic. So that's why I say that productivity is the name of the game, not necessarily just in the overall macro sense, but also in the sense of the government will need to do better, what it does, and it has to do it with less money. In the report that was published by Bill's office in the World Bank, I'll mention one aspect where I think the reforms are quite necessary. Is investment in tertiary education, where the region is investing or spending a lot in universities, and we need to spend more in technical and technological training, short courses and short cycle courses. I think, if we're to grow faster, this has to be an opportunity for bold actions. Business as usual is not going to take us out of this crisis. We need to essentially say, well, we're doing this, we should stop doing this, we haven't been doing it in the right way. We need to redesign some of these government programs. It's the time for a conversation about budgets that use zero as a benchmark, not the inertia, not what the budget allocation was last year plus inflation, but zero. Show me that your program for any government entity is impactful. And I think if we're not able to do that, we can seriously miss this opportunity to use this crisis as a vehicle for reform or for change in the way the government operates.
Well, none of the three of you are painting a very positive picture for me here, because some of these problems are intractable. You mentioned earlier, Mauricio, that the choices were between some sort of rules and populism. And to avoid the populism option, one probably needs to consider some of these tax remedies on wealth and on loopholes and other things. And I say that coming from a country where loopholes are the name of the game, and tax expenditures are enormous. So I think that's an area that needs to be looked at. In terms of Bill, you mentioned the universities, and you also, Mauricio. There are innovations in other regions to deal with some of these education challenges. In Korea, they have these things they call Meister schools, taken from the German kind of model. They're high schools, but they're technical high schools where at the end of it, you can take an aircraft engine apart and put it back together. But I think there are a lot of vested interests in the region, right? Vested interests in the education sector, vested interests. Bill, you mentioned competition policy and new startups, et cetera, et cetera. It's plagued, I think, the region, because I think the powers that be are very comfortable, right? We used to do research on Argentina as to why they were not more successful in some new export areas, and it's because many of the firms are very comfortable with very little competition at home. So I guess one takeaway is everyone needs to read your office's report, Bill. We'll have to circulate that. And Nora, we also, I think, should circulate your already published paper. My apologies for mislabeling it. I just saw it in the PowerPoint, and I didn't know. And we will try and keep this conversation going, because I think maybe at GW we have an opportunity to talk more about Latin America, because we're in Washington and because you are all accessible. So I'm hoping that sometime in 2022 we can reconvene. Maybe, Bill, you can be the host at the World Bank if we can ever do things in person again. But I want to thank you very much for joining us. I hope that the people listening, and we had quite a good crowd. These Zoom events are very competitive, so we have to be grateful that people were listening. And we will record it. And as you said, Mauricio, it'll be available through CIBER, which is the group that is the main sponsor here. They'll put it up on YouTube, and we'll send you all the links. So thanks very much for joining. I appreciate it very much. And it was nice that I could bring the three of you together. I think that was my role, which was so the three of you could chat and see each other on the screen. So Mauricio Cárdenas, thank you very much. Bill Maloney, thank you very much. Nora Lustig,
thank you very
much.
Thank you.
Thank
hope
you.
to see you all soon.
To be here.
Bye-bye,
Ciao, ciao.
Great to see you.